The wind across the Arizona Territory speaks a language of forgotten things, of sun-bleached bones and promises broken like dry twigs. For Amelia Hayes, a woman haunted by the ghosts of a family she'd lost, it was a constant lonely hymn. But one blood-red sunset, as a storm gathered its fury, that wind would carry more than dust and sorrow. It would carry the faint groan of a dying man, a Navajo warrior, whose life would hang by the thread of her courage. Her choice that evening would not just defy a town, but would call forth an echo from the canyons, an echo made of 200 silent warriors who would change her world forever. The year was 1878, and the world of Amelia Hayes had shrunk to the size of her 160-acre homestead, a patch of stubborn dirt carved out of the vast, indifferent expanse of the Arizona Territory. Her cabin, built of sturdy ponderosa pine by hands that were now dust, stood as a solitary sentinel against the sweeping mesas and the jagged teeth of the distant Chusca Mountains. It was a lonely existence, punctuated only by the cry of the hawk and the ceaseless whisper of the wind, a wind that always seemed to be telling stories she couldn't quite hear. Amelia was a ghost in her own life. 3 years prior, a cholera epidemic had swept through their small Ohio town with the speed and ferocity of a prairie fire, claiming her husband David and their 5-year-old daughter Lily. The light had gone out of her world, leaving behind a hollow ache that no amount of time or distance could fill. Fleeing the memories that clung to every corner of her old life, she had used the last of their savings to travel west, seeking not a new beginning, but a place where her ending could be quiet and unobserved. She chose a plot of land miles from the nearest settlement, the rough-and-tumble town of Redemption, a place that held no redemption for her. Her father had been a doctor, a man of science and compassion, and he had taught her much. Amelia possessed a healer's touch, a knowledge of poultices, tinctures, and the grim art of setting a bone. In Redemption, they called her the Hermit Woman, whispering about the strange herbs she gathered in the foothills. They mistook her grief for aloofness, her silence for pride. She kept to herself, trading pelts and surplus vegetables for the few supplies she couldn't grow, or make her interactions with the townsfolk brief and transactional. On this particular afternoon, the sky was the color of a fresh bruise. The air grew thick and heavy, charged with an energy that made the hairs on her arms stand up. A summer monsoon was brewing a violent, life-giving tempest that could turn the dry arroyos into raging torrents in a matter of minutes. Securing the shutters and bringing her few chickens into the small, sturdy coop, Amelia felt a familiar pang of isolation. Storms were the loneliest times, when the vastness of the land felt most like a prison. As the first fat drops of rain began to splatter against the hard-packed earth, she heard it. It wasn't the wind nor the rumble of distant thunder. It was a sound that didn't belong, a low, guttural moan, almost lost in the rising gale. She froze her hand on the cabin door, straining to listen. There it was again, weaker this time, a piteous sound of pure agony. Common sense, the voice of survival in this harsh land, screamed at her to go inside, bar the door and ignore it. Out here, trouble found you easily enough without you going looking for it. It could be a wounded animal, a mountain lion perhaps, or worse, a drifter looking for an easy mark. Redemption was a magnet for men with hard eyes and quick hands, but the sound was undeniably human. It carried a note of despair that resonated with the hollow space in her own chest. Cursing her conscience, Amelia grabbed a heavy wool cloak and her father's old medical bag, its leather worn smooth with use. She also took the Winchester rifle that leaned against the wall, its cold weight a small comfort. She followed the sound, heading towards a rocky outcrop, about a quarter-mile from her cabin. The rain was coming down in sheets, now cold and blinding, turning the ground to a slick, treacherous mud. The wind tore at her cloak, whipping her hair across her face. Thunder cracked overhead, a deafening explosion that seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth. There, wedged between two large sandstone boulders, lay the source of the sound. It was a man, a Navajo man. He was sprawled in an unnatural position, his face ashen under his dark skin. His deerskin leggings were torn and soaked in blood, and one leg was bent at a horrifying angle. A deep, ragged gash ran from his shoulder, down his chest, a wound that spoke of claws, a mountain lion most likely. His breathing was shallow, a ragged, hitching sound. He was young, probably no older than 25, with high cheekbones and a strong jaw, but his eyes were clouded with pain and the encroaching shadow of death. Amelia's heart hammered against her ribs. The tensions between the settlers in Redemption and the Navajo, or the Dine as they called themselves, were a constant simmering threat. The local cattle baron, a ruthless man named Bartholomew Thorne, made no secret of his belief that the only good native was a dead one. He and his ranch hands treated the Dine with a contempt that often bled into open violence. To be found helping one, especially a warrior, would be seen as a betrayal. They would call her an accomplice, an enemy. Thorne could use it as an excuse to run her off her land he'd made clear he coveted for its access to a year-round spring. The man's eyes fluttered open and fixed on her. There was no fear in them, only a flicker of surprise and a deep, weary resignation. He began to chant, his voice a hoarse whisper, the words of a death song meant to guide his spirit to the next world. He was giving up. In that moment, Amelia didn't see a Navajo warrior. She didn't see the politics of the territory or the hatred of Bartholomew Thorne. She saw the ghost of her husband, his face pale with fever. She saw the fading light in her daughter's eyes. She saw another human being slipping away, and the healer in her, the part of her that her father had nurtured, the part that grief had not yet managed to extinguish, rose up and refused to let it happen. No, she whispered as much to herself as to him. Not today. Making a decision that would irrevocably alter the course of her life, Amelia Hayes knelt in the mud, and the driving rain looked into the eyes of the dying stranger, and prepared to fight death one more time. She was no longer a ghost hiding from the world. She was a doctor's daughter, and there was work to be done. Getting him back to the cabin was a monumental struggle. The warrior was wiry but dense with muscle, and moving him sent waves of agony through his body, causing him to cry out in a language she didn't understand, but whose meaning was terrifyingly clear. Amelia was strong, hardened by the daily toil of homesteading, but his dead weight tested the limits of her endurance. She fashioned a crude travois from her cloak and two sturdy branches, dragging him inch by agonizing inch through the mud. The rain plastered her clothes to her skin, and the wind howled like a legion of banshees. By the time she hauled him over the threshold of her cabin, she was shaking with exhaustion, her lungs burning. She laid him on a pallet of blankets near the hearth, the only place in the small cabin that offered any warmth. The fire hissed and popped, casting dancing shadows on the walls and illuminating the severity of his injuries. The leg was a compound fracture, the bone having broken through the skin. It was dirty, a breeding ground for infection that could kill him as surely as the cougar's claws. The gash on his chest was deep, and he had lost a dangerous amount of blood. He was burning with fever, his skin hot and dry to the touch. For the next several hours, Amelia worked with a desperate, focused intensity. The world outside the cabin, with its storm and its dangers, ceased to exist. There was only the patient, the injuries, and the remedies. She cleansed the wounds with boiled water and a harsh lye soap, ignoring his pained gasps. She stitched the gash on his chest closed with a fine needle and gut suture her hands, moving with a surgeon's steady precision. The leg was the greatest challenge. Setting a bone like that was brutal, agonizing work. She gave him a strip of leather to bite down on, and bracing herself, pulled and manipulated the limb until the fractured ends of the bone aligned. The man screamed a raw, primal sound that was swallowed by the storm and then mercifully passed out. Working quickly, she packed the wound with a poultice of yarrow to staunch the bleeding and comfrey root, which she knew as knit-bone, to encourage healing. Then she fashioned a splint from pieces of a broken crate and strips of linen, immobilizing the leg from his hip to his ankle. As the storm outside began to recede, replaced by the steady drumming of rain on the roof, the warrior's fever began to climb. He thrashed in his delirium, muttering words in his native tongue, Dine Bizard. Amelia brewed a tea of willow bark, a potent fever reducer, and forced the bitter liquid between his lips, a spoonful at a time. She sat by his side all night, bathing his face with cool water, changing his dressings, and listening to the tortured ramblings of his fevered mind. She learned his name, or what she thought was his name, as he repeated it over and over, Hoshke. It meant warrior, or fierce one, in his language, a fitting name for the man who was now fighting a silent, desperate battle for his life on her floor. For 3 days, he hovered between life and death. Amelia barely slept, snatching a few moments of rest in a chair by the fire. She moved like an automaton driven by a deep-seated refusal to fail. On the 4th day, his fever broke. She awoke to find him conscious, his dark eyes clear and watchful, tracking her every movement. The silence in the cabin was thick with unspoken questions. He was a warrior of a tribe that was at best distrusted and at worst hated by her people. She was a white woman, living alone on land that had once been his ancestors. They were separated by a chasm of language, culture, and history. Yet in that small shared space, they were simply 2 people bound by an act of mercy. She offered him a bowl of thin broth, and he drank it slowly, his gaze never leaving her face. He tried to speak, but his throat was raw, and the words came out as a rasp. He gestured to his leg, then to her, a clear question in his eyes. "You were hurt," she said, speaking slowly, as if he might understand the tone if not the words. "A mountain lion, I think, and a bad fall. I found you in the storm." She pointed to her chest, and then to the neatly stitched wound on his. "I cleaned the wounds. And your leg? It was broken." She pointed to the splint. "It will take time to heal." "A long time." He seemed to understand the gist of it. He looked down at his splintered leg, then at the stitches, and a look of profound understanding crossed his features. He knew the severity of his injuries. He knew that alone in the wilderness, they would have been a death sentence. He had been singing his death song, prepared for the end, and this strange woman with the sad eyes and gentle hands had pulled him back. He gave a single slow nod. It was a gesture of acknowledgement, of gratitude, and of respect. A week later, just as a fragile routine was beginning to form between them, trouble arrived in the form of 2 riders. Amelia saw them from the window, their figures dark against the bright morning sun. It was Floyd and Peterson, 2 of Bartholomew Thorne's most brutish ranch hands. Her stomach clenched into a tight, cold knot. She met them on the porch, her Winchester held loosely in her hands, its presence a clear warning. "Mornin', Ma'am," Floyd said, a cruel smirk playing on his lips. He was a big man with a florid face and small, piggy eyes. "Mr. Thorne was just wondering if you'd seen any trouble out this way." Heard there was a Navajo buck spotted near here a week or so back. Word is he tangled with a cat and lost. Amelia's face remained a neutral mask. The only trouble I've seen is the kind that rides up on horseback when it's not welcome. Peterson, a wiry man with a nervous twitch, shifted in his saddle. Now ain't no call for that, Mrs. Hayes. We're just being neighborly. A lone woman like you. Anything could happen. Mr. Thorne, he worries. The lie was so blatant it was almost comical. You can tell Mr. Thorne I'm perfectly capable of taking care of myself, she said, her voice like ice. Now, if you're finished being neighborly, this is private property. Floyd's smirk widened. His eyes flickered towards the cabin door as if he could see through the wood. Heard a rumor you were some kind of healer. Fixin' up strays. Just wanted to make sure you ain't fixin' up the wrong kind of stray. Mr. Thorne wouldn't take kindly to that. Not at all. The threat was unmistakable. They knew, or they suspected. A hunter must have found the site of the attack, seen the tracks of one person being dragged away. And they had come to her. I have a guest in my home, Amelia said, her voice, dropping each word, precise and dangerous. He is a sick man under my care. He is not your concern. You will leave now. For a moment, Floyd looked as if he might dismount and force the issue. His hand twitched towards the pistol on his hip. Amelia raised the barrel of the Winchester, just an inch. Their eyes locked in a silent battle of wills. From inside the cabin there was a faint sound, the scrape of something moving across the floor. Floyd's gaze darted to the door again, and the smirk returned triumphant this time. He had his confirmation. "Have it your way, Mum," he drawled, pulling on his reins. "But I'd be careful. Sometimes a sickness can spread. To the whole neighborhood." They turned their horses and rode away, leaving a cloud of dust and a heavy sense of dread in their wake. Amelia stood on the porch for a long time, the rifle feeling heavy in her hands. She had made her choice in the storm, an act of simple humanity. But she knew with chilling certainty that Bartholomew Thorne would not see it that way. He would see it as an act of war. The debt she was paying for a stranger's life was only just beginning to be tallied. In the weeks that followed the visit from Thorne's men, an unspoken understanding grew within the small cabin. Hashki, though still weak, was a man of immense pride and resilience. He watched everything Amelia did, his intelligent eyes taking in the rhythms of her solitary life. He saw the way she tended her garden, the skill with which she mended her clothes, the weariness that sometimes settled on her face when she thought he wasn't looking. He saw her strength, and he saw her loneliness. Amelia, in turn, learned to read his silent language. A slight inclination of his head was a request for water. A tightening of his jaw was a sign that his pain was worsening. She learned that he possessed a quiet, dry wit, often expressed through a subtle glint in his eye after she struggled with some particularly difficult chore. They were two solitudes coexisting in a fragile peace, their communication a tapestry woven from gestures and shared glances. She would speak to him in English, telling him about her day, about the hawk that nested in the tall pine, about the memories of her father's clinic. She didn't know if he understood the words, but he listened his attention unwavering. It felt good to hear her own voice, filling the silence to speak to someone other than the chickens and the ghosts of her past. His healing was slow but steady. The gash on his chest closed into a clean pink scar. His leg, however, was a different matter. She knew it would be months before he could put his full weight on it, and even then he might walk with a limp for the rest of his life. He was a warrior, a hunter, a man whose life depended on his physical prowess. The knowledge of this permanent injury was a heavy weight in the room, another thing they didn't speak of. One morning, nearly 2 months after his arrival, Amelia awoke to find him gone. The pallet by the fire was empty, the blankets neatly folded. A small, intricately carved wooden bird sat in the center of the pile. It was a rough but beautiful thing, whittled from a piece of scrap wood with what must have been her smallest kitchen knife. Panic seized her first, a cold, sharp fear. Had Thorne's men come back in the night? Had they taken him? She rushed outside. The ground was still damp from a pre-dawn shower. There, leading away from the cabin, was a single set of tracks. One clear footprint, and beside it, the deep drag mark of a crutch. He had fashioned a crude crutch and left on his own. He hadn't been taken. He had chosen to leave. A feeling of profound and unexpected abandonment washed over her. It was foolish, she knew. He couldn't stay forever. He had his own people, his own life. She had simply been a port in a storm. But his silent, constant presence had become a part of her world, a buffer against the crushing loneliness. Now the silence of the cabin was deafening. He had left without a word, without a farewell. The small wooden bird felt like a paltry substitute for a goodbye. The consequences of her actions were not long in coming. Hashki's departure had not absolved her in the eyes of redemption. It had only confirmed her guilt. The story, twisted and embellished by Floyd and Peterson, had spread through the town like a contagion. Amelia Hayes, the strange widow, was a turncoat, an Indian lover. She had harbored an enemy, a savage who had likely killed settlers. Her next trip into town for supplies was a nightmare. As she walked down the dusty main street, conversations ceased. People turned their backs. The merchant at the general store, a man named Henderson, who had always been civil, served her with a grim face, his movements brusque, his answers clipped. When she tried to pay, he slid the coins back across the counter. "We don't want your money here, Mrs. Hayes," he said, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "Your credit is no good in redemption." Stunned, she looked around. Faces stared back at her, a mixture of fear, suspicion, and naked hostility. Old Mrs. Gable, a woman for whom Amelia had once prepared a salve for arthritis, pulled her children close, as if Amelia herself were a disease. The final blow came from Bartholomew Thorne. He was standing outside the saloon, flanked by his men, a smug look of victory on his face. He was a man who owned most of the land, the sheriff, and the fear of everyone in town. "Seems you've worn out your welcome." "Mrs. Hayes," he boomed, ensuring everyone could hear. "Decent folk don't take kindly to those who aid and abet murderers and thieves. That land you're squatting on, it's prime grazing land. I'd be willing to take it off your hands for a fair price. Say $50 enough to get you on a stagecoach and out of this territory." The offer was an insult. The land and cabin were worth 10 times that. It wasn't an offer. It was a threat. "My deed is filed and legal, Mr. Thorne," she said, her voice shaking slightly despite her efforts to keep it steady. "The land is mine." Thorne laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "Deeds can get lost. Fires happen. Accidents happen too, especially to women living all alone so far from town. I'd think about my offer. I'll give you until the end of the month." Amelia walked back to her wagon, her head held high, but her heart felt like a stone in her chest. She had been utterly and completely cast out. She was more alone now than ever before. The following weeks were a slow-burning siege. Her fence was cut one night, and a dozen of Thorne's cattle were driven through her garden, trampling the vegetables she needed to survive the coming winter. Someone threw a rock through her window, a jagged shard of glass landing on the very spot where Hashki's pallet had been. The well she depended on was fouled with a dead animal, and she spent 2 days cleaning it out, her body aching, her spirit flagging. Each act of vandalism, Each new hardship chipped away at her resolve. Fear was a constant companion. She slept with the Winchester by her bed, starting at every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of leaves outside. The loneliness she had once sought as a comfort had become a terrifying vulnerability. She had saved a man's life, and in return, her own life was being systematically destroyed. He had left without a word, leaving her to face the wrath of a town that saw her compassion as a crime. The small wooden bird on her mantel felt less like a gift and more like a symbol of her own naivety. The debt had been paid, but it seemed she was the only one paying it. The end of the month arrived with the chilling finality of a death sentence. The late autumn air had a sharp, brittle edge, and the leaves of the cottonwood trees by the creek had turned a brilliant, dying yellow. Amelia had spent the last few days in a state of hypervigilance, rationing her remaining food and reinforcing the door with a heavy wooden bar. She had refused Thorne's offer, sending word back with a passing trapper that the land was not for sale. It was an act of defiance she knew would have consequences. They came in the late afternoon, when the sun was low in the sky, casting long, menacing shadows across the valley. It wasn't just 2 riders this time. It was Thorne himself along with a dozen of his men. They were a posse of vigilantes, their faces grim, their intent clear. They carried rifles across their saddles and coils of rope. Some carried torches unlit for now, but their purpose was horribly clear. Amelia watched them approach from her window, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. This was it, the final act. They would not just vandalize her property this time. They would burn her out, drive her off, or worse. She was one woman against 13 armed men. The Winchester felt impossibly heavy. She could perhaps take 1 or 2 of them with her, but it was a futile gesture. Thorne reined in his horse just beyond her fence line, his men fanning out behind him in a semicircle, cutting off any chance of escape. He looked at her small cabin as if it were a personal affront, an unsightly blemish on the landscape he believed was his by right. Amelia Hayes. He bellowed his voice, echoing in the quiet afternoon. Your time is up. We gave you a chance to leave peacefully. You chose to side with savages, so you'll be treated like one. We're claiming this land in the name of the decent folk of redemption. You can walk away now with your life, or you can be cleared out with the rest of the trash. Amelia stepped out onto the porch. She did not raise her rifle, but kept it held across her body, a symbol of defiance rather than an immediate threat. Her face was pale, but her eyes were steady. She had lost everything once before. She would not let this bully see her fear. This is my home, Thorne, she called back, her voice clear and stronger than she felt. You have no right, Thorne laughed. Right out here, woman. We make our own rights. And we don't make them for traitors. He nodded to 2 of his men. Floyd Peterson. Take the door. The rest of you get your torches ready. Floyd and Peterson dismounted, cruel grins on their faces. They started towards the cabin, their boots crunching on the dry soil. Amelia's knuckles turned white on the stock of her rifle. This was the moment. The world seemed to shrink to the space between her and the 2 advancing men. Time slowed to a crawl, and then it happened. It started not with a sound, but with a shift in the light, a flicker of movement on the high ridge that overlooked her homestead. Thorne saw it too. He paused, his hand raised, squinting into the setting sun. One by one they appeared, silent figures on horseback, materializing as if from the very rock of the ridge itself. They were Navajo warriors, their forms silhouetted against the blood-red sky. First there were 10, then 20, then 50. They kept coming, pouring over the crest of the hill in a silent, inexorable tide, lining the entire length of the ridge. They were armed not for hunting, but for war with rifles, bows, and lances. Their faces painted with the stark symbols of their clans were impassive, unreadable stone masks. There were 200 of them. A gasp went through Thorn's men. Horses shifted nervously, sensing the sudden, palpable tension in the air. The confident smirks vanished, replaced by wide-eyed disbelief and primal fear. The valley which moments before had held only Thorn's blustering voice was now filled with a silence so profound it was a physical weight. It was the silence of the canyon, the silence of the ancient rock, the silence of judgment. At the center of the line of warriors, 2 figures moved forward to the edge of the ridge. One was an older man, with a face like a weathered map, his long grey hair braided with eagle feathers. He sat on his horse with an undeniable air of authority. This was Natania, great chief of the Dine. Beside him sat a younger man, straight and proud. One of his legs was braced in a new, expertly crafted support. It was Hashke. He met Amelia's gaze across the distance, and for the first time she saw his face not as a patient, but as who he was: a leader, a son of a chief, a man of power and standing among his people. He raised his hand, not in a wave, but in a sign of acknowledgement, a gesture that spoke volumes. It said, "I didn't forget. I did not abandon you." Nataani, the chief, then raised his own hand, palm open a sign to halt. His voice, when it came, was not a shout, but it carried across the valley with breathtaking clarity, speaking in the Dine language. Beside him, another warrior translated his English words, ringing out like a hammer on an anvil. "Bartholomew Thorn, you stand on land that is protected. The woman who lives here is family to the Dine. She practices the sacred way of balance. She saved the life of my son. This is a debt of honor, and we have come to pay it." He paused, letting the words sink in. The translator continued, "She does not stand alone. Her fence is our fence. Her well is our well. Her home is our home. An insult to her is an insult to us. A threat to her is a threat to every one of my warriors. Look upon this ridge. We are her family now. We are her kin. We are her guard." Thorn was apoplectic, his face a mask of purple rage, but he was also a pragmatist. He looked at his 12 men, then up at the 200 silent, heavily armed warriors who now held the high ground, their arrows and bullets able to rain down destruction at a single command. It wasn't a fight. It would be a slaughter. Hashke had not simply gone home. He had returned to his people and told them what had happened. He had told them of the woman with sad eyes who had fought death for him in a lonely cabin during a storm, and his people, led by his father, had answered the call of a life debt. They had not come with violence. They had come as a statement, a living wall of protection. Thorn stared at the ridge, then at Amelia, his eyes filled with a new, venomous hatred. He had been outmaneuvered, his brute force rendered impotent by an ancient code of honor he could never comprehend. "This ain't over." He spat the words, almost a whisper of fury. He yanked hard on his horse's reins, wheeling it around. "Let's go!" he snarled at his men. Without another word, the posse turned and rode away, their retreat hasty and ignominious. They did not look back. Amelia stood on her porch, the Winchester hanging limp in her hand, her body trembling with the aftermath of adrenaline. She looked up at the ridge at the 200 silent sentinels watching over her. They were ghosts no more, but a living, breathing testament to a promise kept. She had saved one dying man, and in return he had brought her a family of 200 warriors. The silence they offered was no longer one of loneliness, but one of unwavering, absolute protection. The silent vigil on the ridge didn't last forever. As dusk settled, painting the sky in shades of lavender and rose, the warriors melted back into the canyons as quietly as they had appeared. But they did not vanish completely. In the days and weeks that followed, Amelia realized that her life had fundamentally changed. She was no longer alone. Her new family was a constant, subtle presence. She would wake in the morning to find a brace of rabbits or a freshly caught fish left silently on her porch. When her woodpile ran low, she would return from a walk to find it mysteriously restocked with perfectly cut and stacked juniper. They were ghosts, but now they were benevolent ones. A small rotating contingent of warriors maintained a discreet camp in the nearby foothills, their presence a silent deterrent to Thorn and his men, who now gave her homestead a wide berth. Communication began haltingly at first. A young warrior named Klar, who had learned some English at a trading post, began to act as an intermediary. He would approach her cabin, always stopping a respectful distance away, and they would talk. Through him, Amelia learned more about her protectors. She learned that Hashke was recovering well, his spirit undimmed by his injury. She learned that the wooden bird he had left her was a symbol of gratitude, carved to represent the spirit of healing. In return, she offered what she could. When one of the young Navajo men fell from a horse and broke his arm, Klar brought him to her. With a quiet confidence born of her father's teachings, she set the bone and fashioned a sling. Her reputation as a healer, once a source of suspicion in redemption, became a source of reverence among the Dain. They called her the woman who walks in the night, a name of respect for the one who had ventured into the storm to save one of their own. This strange, unprecedented alliance did not go unnoticed. News of the standoff traveled fast in the territory. It was a story too fantastic to remain quiet, a lone white woman being protected by a massive band of Navajo warriors against a powerful cattle baron. The narrative that reached Fort Defiance, the nearest U.S. Army outpost, was a twisted and dangerous version, carefully seeded by Bartholomew Thorn. Thorn, humiliated, but not defeated, had ridden straight to the fort. He painted a picture not of a personal grudge, but of a massive security threat. He spoke of a renegade white woman who was arming the Navajo, inciting them to violence, and creating a private army on the edge of settled territory. He claimed the warriors were raiding his cattle, a lie, as the raids were his own men done to create a pretext, and that it was only a matter of time before they attacked the town of Redemption itself. The commander of Fort Defiance dispatched a patrol led by a man named Captain Robert Sterling. Sterling was a career soldier, a veteran of the Bloody Plains Wars. He was a man who believed in order and the letter of the law, and he had little patience for the messy complexities of the frontier. He had seen the brutal aftermath of raids and uprisings, and held a deep-seated weary suspicion of all native tribes. He rode towards Amelia's homestead, not as a peacekeeper, but as a man expecting to find the crucible of a new war. Sterling arrived with a full company of 20 cavalrymen, their blue uniforms and polished brass, a stark, jarring sight in the rugged landscape. They moved with military precision, surrounding the homestead, before Sterling and a small honor guard approached. Amelia met him on the porch just as she had with Thorn's men. But this encounter felt different. Sterling was not a thug. He was an instrument of a power far greater and more dangerous than a local cattle baron. He was a handsome man in his late 30s with a stern jaw and eyes the color of a winter sky. "Mrs. Amelia Hayes?" he asked, his voice formal and devoid of warmth. He did not dismount. I am Captain Robert Sterling, United States Army. I'm here to investigate reports of an illegal militia being formed on this property. Reports of collusion with hostile natives leading to unrest and livestock theft in the region." Amelia's heart sank. Thorn had played his trump card. There is no militia here, Captain, and no hostility except that which was brought to my doorstep by Bartholomew Thorn. Sterling's expression didn't change. My reports state that over 200 armed Navajo warriors confronted Mr. Thorn and his men on this very land. They have established a permanent encampment nearby, and are, by all accounts, acting as your private army. Is that not collusion? They are acting as my protectors, Amelia corrected him, her voice firm. Because Mr. Thorn threatened to burn my home to the ground and drive me from my legally owned property. And why would they do that for you? Sterling asked, a note of deep skepticism in his voice. The Navajo are not known for their altruism towards settlers. Because I saved the life of one of their own, she said simply. It's a matter of honor. Something Mr. Thorn knows nothing about. From the corner of her eye, Amelia saw movement in the trees. Kla and 3 other warriors had appeared, watching the soldiers with hawk-like intensity. They were outnumbered and outgunned, but they stood their ground, silent guardians. Sterling noticed them, and his hand instinctively rested on the butt of his pistol. Them, he asked. Are they part of your protection detail? They are my friends, Amelia said. The captain's lips thinned into a hard line. Mrs. Hayes, you are walking a very dangerous line. In this territory, a friend to the Navajo is often seen as an enemy to everyone else. I am placing you under formal investigation. You are not to leave this property. My men will be making camp nearby to monitor the situation. I suggest you tell your friends to disperse. Their continued presence here is considered an act of provocation by the United States government. If they do not comply, I will be forced to remove them. Captain Sterling wheeled his horse around and rode back to his men, leaving Amelia standing on the porch with a chilling new reality. She had escaped the grasp of a greedy rancher, only to fall into the jaws of the U.S. Army. Her unlikely alliance, born from an act of compassion, was now being framed as an act of treason. The family that had given her safety had now placed her in the greatest peril of her life. The presence of the U.S. cavalry turned the valley into a powder keg. Captain Sterling's men established a formal, disciplined camp 1/2 mile from Amelia's cabin, a constant, watchful presence. The blue-coated soldiers were a stark line, drawn in the sand, separating Amelia and her Navajo allies from the rest of the world. Thorn, emboldened by the army's arrival, spread more poison in redemption, painting Sterling as the hero who had come to save them all from the renegade woman and her savage horde. Amelia was effectively a prisoner on her own land. Sterling visited daily, his questions sharp and methodical. He interrogated her about Hashke, about the number of warriors, their weaponry, their intentions. He was a man searching for a clear enemy, and he was determined to find one. Amelia answered him honestly, her patience wearing thin with each accusatory question. "Captain," she said, during one tense meeting on her porch, "you are looking for a war that isn't here. The only man who wants violence is Bartholomew Thorn. He wants my land. He's using you and the uniform you wear to get it." "Mr. Thorn is a respected citizen and the largest landowner in this district," Sterling retorted stiffly. "The Diné are a people with whom the U.S. government has a complicated treaty. Their massing in such numbers is a violation of that treaty's spirit, if not its letter. My orders are to maintain peace and security for American citizens." "And am I not an American citizen?" She shot back, her voice rising. "Does my security not matter because I chose to show kindness to a man of a different race?" Her words seemed to strike a nerve, but Sterling's face remained an impassive mask. He was a man trapped between his orders, his prejudices, and a situation that defied the simple black-and-white logic of a military field manual. The standoff couldn't last. The tipping point came a week later. Thorne, growing impatient, decided to force Sterling's hand. Under the cover of darkness, two of his men, Floyd and Peterson, snuck past the army pickets and set fire to one of Amelia's outlying storage sheds. The flames lit up the night sky, a beacon of manufactured aggression. The cavalry was roused instantly. Sterling, seeing the fire, assumed the worst. This was it, the Navajo attack he had been warned about. He ordered his company to mount up and advance on Amelia's homestead, ready for a full-blown engagement. At the same moment, the Navajo warriors, seeing the fire and hearing the army bugle calls, poured out of their own camp, believing the army was launching a night attack on Amelia. Amelia was caught in the middle, a terrifying pincer movement closing in on her. To her east, the thundering hooves of 20 cavalrymen. To her west, the silent, swift approach of 200 warriors. Her small cabin was about to become the epicenter of a massacre. Thinking fast, she knew words alone would not stop the collision. She needed proof. She remembered something Hashke had tried to communicate to her through gestures before he left, something about the cougar that attacked him. He had pointed to his own moccasins, then made a motion like a boot, and then pointed in the direction of Thorne's ranch. She hadn't understood at the time. Now a horrifying suspicion began to dawn. She ran not towards the soldiers or the warriors, but to the small barn where she kept her tools. Frantically, she grabbed a shovel and a lantern and headed for the rocky outcrop where she had first found Hashke. The ground was hard, but she remembered the spot, a small sheltered overhang where he had lain. The area had been trampled since, but she began to dig frantically in the soft soil under the rock ledge. Minutes later, her shovel struck something metallic. She dropped to her knees, clawing at the dirt with her bare hands. It was a steel leg-hold trap, a massive, cruel device with vicious teeth. But that wasn't all. Caught in the trap's jaws, preserved in the dry earth, was a tattered piece of leather, a piece from a saddlebag stamped with a clear, unmistakable brand, the Bar T of Bartholomew Thorne's ranch. This was the proof. The cougar hadn't attacked Hashke randomly. He had stumbled upon Thorne's illegal trap, likely set on Dine land, to catch wolves. The cougar, perhaps also caught or enraged by the trap, had attacked him then. Hashke hadn't been a casualty of the wild. He had been a victim of Thorne's greed and lawlessness. This was the secret Thorne was willing to kill to protect. Just then, the first of Sterling's men burst through the trees, rifles raised. "Hold it right there, ma'am. Drop the shovel." Sterling himself was right behind them. At the same moment, Natani Hashke and a vanguard of their warriors emerged from the other side, bows drawn. The two forces faced each other over the small clearing with Amelia on her knees, between them, illuminated by her lantern. The air was electric with tension. A single gunshot would unleash hell. Captain Sterling Amelia shouted, her voice ringing with desperate authority. "Hold your fire, I have proof." She held up the trap and the branded piece of leather. "This is why Thorne wants me silenced. My patient, Hashke, wasn't attacked by a wild animal out of chance. He found this, an illegal trap set by Thorne's men on land that does not belong to them. He was a witness. The fire tonight wasn't a Navajo attack. It was Thorne's attempt to destroy the evidence and provoke a war to cover his crimes." Sterling stared at the evidence, his face a storm of conflict. It was a plausible story, one that fit the pieces together in a way that his own biased reports had not. As if on cue, Bartholomew Thorne himself arrived riding hard with a few of his men, expecting to find a battle in progress. Instead, he found a silent tableau, with all eyes turning to him. He saw the trap in Amelia's hands, and the color drained from his face. "That's a lie," he blustered. "She's a traitor consorting with savages to steal my land. Don't listen to her." But it was too late. The truth was in his panic. Natani spoke his voice, calm and powerful, with Kla translating instantly. The man of the army can see the brand. He knows the law of traps. He knows this is a crime. The woman who walks in the night speaks the truth. Captain Sterling looked from the trap to Thorne's terrified face, and then to Amelia's, which was streaked with dirt but resolute. He had built his career on order and evidence, and the evidence was right in front of him. He had been a pawn, and his rigid adherence to protocol had nearly made him a murderer. His decision was swift. "Sergeant," he commanded, his voice like flint. "Arrest Mr. Thorne and his men for setting illegal traps for incitement to violence and for the attempted murder of Amelia Hayes." Thorne's men, seeing their leader cornered and the army turning on them, threw down their weapons. Thorne himself sputtered in rage and disbelief as 2 cavalrymen dragged him from his horse. The standoff was broken. The warriors lowered their bows. The soldiers lowered their rifles. In the sudden quiet aftermath, under the light of the moon and the dying embers of the fire, a new understanding was forged in the crucible of near violence. Amelia Hayes had not just saved a life and found a family. She had exposed a truth that had prevented a war. The arrest of Bartholomew Thorne sent shock waves through the territory. Stripped of his power and wealth, his crimes laid bare by Captain Sterling's official report, Thorne's empire of fear crumbled. Floyd and Peterson, under interrogation, confessed to everything: the illegal traps, the constant harassment of Amelia, and setting the fire under Thorne's orders. The law, so often a tool for the powerful, had for once served justice. Captain Sterling remained in the valley for another week, not as a warden, but as an observer. He made a formal visit to Amelia's cabin the day after the arrest. He dismounted, removed his hat, and stood before her on the porch, not as an officer, but as a man humbled. "Mrs. Hayes," he began, his voice stripped of its earlier arrogance. "My orders were to prevent a conflict. I see now that I was on the verge of starting one. I misjudged you, and I misjudged the situation. Your courage that night, it averted a tragedy. You were following your information, Captain," Amelia replied, offering a grace he did not deserve, but desperately needed. "The fault lies with the man who gave you lies." "Perhaps," Sterling conceded, his gaze drifting towards the foothills where the Navajo camp was. "I have also been speaking with Natani through his translator. I am learning that honor is not always written in a field manual." He looked back at her. "The U.S. Army owes you a debt." Before he left, Sterling posted an official notice, countersigned by the territorial marshal, declaring Amelia Hayes's homestead a protected property, explicitly warning against any form of trespass or intimidation. He ensured the true story was entered into the official record, cementing her status not as a renegade, but as a peacemaker. With Thorne gone and the army's protection guaranteed, a new era of quiet stability began for Amelia. The town of Redemption, fickle in its loyalties, slowly began to change its tune. Some, seeing the fall of Thorne, now viewed Amelia with a grudging respect. Others, hearing the true story, felt a sense of shame for their part in her persecution. A few, like the merchant Henderson, even made the long ride out to her homestead to offer a quiet, shame-faced apology, which Amelia accepted with a simple nod. She had no interest in their fickle approval, but she welcomed the end of their hostility. Her truest family remained the Dine. Her bond with them, forged in crisis, now deepened into a genuine kinship. Hashke, walking now with a pronounced but dignified limp, became a regular visitor, often accompanied by Kla. They would sit with her by the fire, sharing stories. She taught them about her world, about the cities of the East and the medicine of her father. They, in turn, taught her about theirs. They taught her the names of the constellations in the vast desert sky, the healing properties of plants she had never known, and the stories of their people, the holy ones who had emerged from the earth. They taught her the principle of living in balance and harmony with the world, a philosophy that soothed the ragged edges of her own grief in a way that nothing else ever had. She was no longer just the healer. She was a student. She never remarried, never had another child. Her life was not what she had once imagined it would be back in Ohio with David and Lily. It was something stranger, wilder, and more profound. Her small cabin was no longer a monument to her loneliness, but a bridge between two worlds. It was a place where a U.S. Army captain had learned about honor from a Navajo chief, where a warrior and a homesteader could share a quiet cup of coffee, where the deep wounds of a fractured land could for a brief moment begin to heal. Amelia Hayes lived out her days on that patch of stubborn dirt. She became a legend in the territory, a quiet woman of immense strength, the woman who walks in the night, whose family numbered 200 warriors. She had come to the West seeking a place to be forgotten to let her story end. Instead, she had found a place where her story truly began. She had learned that a family is not always the one you are born into, but sometimes it is the one you earn, with courage, with compassion, and with a willingness to answer a whisper on the wind. Her legacy was not one of blood or name, but was written in the land itself, a testament to where two rivers once destined to run apart had found a way to meet. The story of Amelia Hayes is a powerful reminder that the heart of the Old West wasn't just found in its gunfights and gold rushes, but in the quiet moments of extraordinary courage that history often forgets. It's a testament to the idea that family isn't merely about blood, but about honor, respect, and the depths of the human heart. Amelia's choice to save one man, an enemy, by the standards of her time, created a ripple effect that brought down a tyrant, prevented a war, and built a bridge between two cultures. Her legacy, guarded by the silent warriors of the canyon, proves that the greatest strength is often found in compassion, and the richest life is one spent in service to others. If this story of unexpected courage and the true meaning of family resonated with you, please give this video a like and share it with someone who appreciates the untold tales of history. And don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you won't miss our next journey into the forgotten heart of the American West.